Who are the X-Men? The X-Men are a superhero team created in 1963 by Stan Lee and Jack Kirby, but ultimately they were made popular by writer Chris Claremont and artist John Byrne, even surpassing Batman in the late 1970s. They would stay the number one selling comic book all through the 80s to the late 1990s. Hey, what's up everybody? Welcome back to Comic Swag. This is your boy J-Rock. Today we're going to be talking about the X-Men, not just their impact on comic books, but their influence in pop culture as a whole. In the 90s, X-Men had a very successful cartoon, knocking 80s powerhouse Ninja Turtles off of the top spot. So this was yet another form of media that X-Men would conquer. After its very successful cartoon in 1992, they would have a hit video game for the Sega Genesis in 1993. This would open the doors for Spider-Man to have his own cartoon in 1994. Now this was very important because this would set the trend for the 1990s. Now in the 1980s, most cartoons were created by toy lines. So the toy companies, they dictated what characters we would get on the screen. In the 1990s, things would change because now most cartoons were based on characters that we saw in comic books. So this would only help the sale of comic books in the 1990s. And also these kids that played with toys in the 80s, they were reading comic books. Now enter the 2000s. So in 2000, an X-Men live action movie was released. So now all those little kids that grew up with the X-Men cartoons in the early 90s were now teenagers filling up those theaters to watch their favorite characters on the big screen for the first time. And I was one of those 4 little kids. Now after the success of X-Men, Spider-Man would have its own live action movie in theaters in 2002. It would be a success at the box office. So after this, history would repeat itself. All those comic book cartoon adaptations from the 90s will now be comic book live action movie adaptations in the 2000s. X-Men has always dictated what media comic book characters would dominate next.
In the 21st century, evil mutants led by Magneto aim to destroy the world. Humans can do nothing against the power of the evil mutant. The only hope is in the X-Men.
Next. But what made the X-Men so different? Well, originally the X-Men were 5 white characters, no different than any other superhero team. Fantastic Four, Justice League, Avengers. But then in the mid-1970s, they would have a reboot that would change the industry forever. They would introduce us to a bunch of new characters, and the hook was every character would have a different racial background. This had never been done before at the time. So you would have Colossus, who is Russian, Wolverine, who's Canadian, Storm, who is black, and Nightcrawler, who is German. No other team really looked like this at the time, and at this time, America was starting to look like this as well, with a lot of immigrants migrating from all over the world to the land of opportunity. We had a lot of people from Korea, China, Mexico coming over to America with children that did not speak the language, so they sometimes felt outcast or like they didn't fit in. And the X-Men tell very similar stories to this, where there are a bunch of mutants and they sometimes have trouble fitting in. People will sometimes assume they're bad just because they're mutants or because of the way they look. So they kind of get like racially profiled. They started getting more readers because they had new and more interesting stories to tell. Girls were also starting to read a lot more comics. And who was their favorite character? No, it wasn't Wonder Woman.
X-Men, I was obsessed with comics. It kind of went X-Men animated series, Amazing Characters of X-Men, X-Men comic books.
The X-Men TV show came out, and I became totally obsessed with Rogue. She was my favorite character.
I remember the X-Men cartoon when I was a kid, and I loved it. I was obsessed with it.
Oh,
and
yeah, sure. Saturday mornings made
the
it.
whole Gambit Rose thing, again, same thing. I was just like,
Yeah.
I just want you to be together.
I saw a poster of Gambit on a guy friend of mine's wall, and was like, who is that?
There was Storm, who was really probably my first feminist icon ever. So I got really into the X-Men as a kid.
And X-Men was definitely one of my favorites starting out, and I think that because I'm mixed, it was one of the first comic book characters where it was a strong female character in Storm.
A lot of girls were picking up X-Men comic books. And writer Chris Claremont, he really started doing this push for more women characters in comic books. Chris Claremont created Psylocke and Captain Britain issue 2 back in December of 1976. Then he created Mystique and Miss Marvel issue 16 back in April of 1978. Then he created Kitty Pryde and Daz and X-Men issue 129 back in January of 1980. And last but not least, he created Rogue and Avengers Annual number 10 back in 1981. While Claremont gets a lot of praise for molding the X-Men, he doesn't get nearly enough credit for bringing a whole generation of girls into comics. And the X-Men would keep doing this in the 90s even after his departure. But what made the X-Men so popular? Well, for starters, every issue ended in to be continued, like a soap opera, which means you would have to buy the next issue to continue the story. Second thing, X-Men was the first team to have just as many girl characters as guy characters. This opened up the opportunity for a bunch of couples on the team, like fan favorite Rogue and Gambit, also Cyclops and Jean Grey, Storm and Forge, and underrated Psylocke and Archangel. This new dynamic would create all kinds of new drama that you could do with storytelling. I don't know about you, but I can't wait for X-Men to hit the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Well, that's enough X-Men talk for today. If you stuck around this long, hopefully you enjoyed the video. And if you did, go ahead and hit that like button. It really goes a long way and I really do appreciate it. Also, if you like X-Men or you like talking comics, go ahead and hit that subscribe button. That way it'll keep you notified on your feed every time a new video drops. And that's all we talk about right here. Alright, other than that, I'll check you guys out next time.